Well, hello and welcome back to Healthy Rebel Speaks Out. And I am so excited today, and I have actually waited a bit of time to have Dr. Johnson, who is with us today, because I have been familiar with his work for years and his discovery of fructose and uric acid. So I really want to get started. And Dr. Johnson, I would like to
Yes.
begin can you just explain how you came upon this whole discovery of fructose, uric acid, and metabolic dysfunction?
Yeah. Hi, Bonnie. Well, thank you. First off, thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show. It's a real pleasure. And yeah, no, that I've been doing research for more than 30 years, and a lot of it has focused on sugar. And I started off as a kidney specialist, and I was interested in high blood pressure and its relationship to the kidney. And through my research, one discovery would lead to another. And we realized that uric acid was really important in high blood pressure and kidney disease and even in metabolic disease. And we were kind of the first ones to really study this from the standpoint that uric acid is more important than just gout. So, for a long time, people are aware about uric acid. There's probably 9 million people who have this disease called gout. It's due to uric acid crystals that form in the joints, and it's a really painful disease. But there's treatments for it. But uric acid is also strongly linked with metabolic disease. It's associated. Recently, it's been shown to be a predictor for Alzheimer's, in addition to diseases like high blood pressure, kidney disease, obesity, and so forth. And so no one really knew that uric acid, what it did. And we started studying it. We found that it was really, really important in driving these diseases, and that it wasn't just a waste product that would crystallize and cause pain. And people with gout, many of them have obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. They're kind of linked. And we think that the reason they're linked is because uric acid has a role in causing those diseases. When we were studying uric acid and we began to realize how important it was, the big question was what was making the uric acid so high? Because humans have very high uric acid. And part of it's due to a mutation that occurred in us millions of years ago, but part of it is from our diet. And in fact, a large reason is our diet. And, we are drinking alcohol and beer, and there are foods like purine-rich foods that can raise uric acid. And these are the kinds of foods that most people with gout have been told about. But actually, sugar also raises uric acid. And when we looked at the rise in uric acid over the last century and its parallel rise of obesity and diabetes, we found that the uric acid was very much linked with sugar intake, especially soft drink intake. And then when we started studying that, we realized that there was a particular sugar that raised uric acid, and that's fructose. And that's in high fructose corn syrup. It's in table sugar like sucrose. Fructose is a part of that. And we found that when we gave fructose to animals, that it was different from other foods, and it was very powerful at making animals get hungry. They would forage for food. They would lose the control of appetite. They would get really fat. We figured out that this was actually how a lot of animals prepare for winter, like hibernation. Like bears will eat huge amounts of berries that have fructose, large amounts, not like the amount we eat when we eat a natural fruit. And spoiler alert, good news, natural fruits are healthy.
So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, natural fruits they have a lot of good things in them. And so they have, flavonols and potassium and vitamin C and all these things that help neutralize it. But when a fruit ripens, the sweetness goes up and a lot of the good things go down. And when it gets kind of like falls off the tree and it's a little mushy and we don't eat it, a lot of animals do. And at that point, it's really just like eating sugar. And so if you eat a lot of the fruit, and these animals eat huge amounts, they can actually trigger this switch. Or I call it a switch,
Right, well,
because all suddenly animals will get fat. It will induce them. It completely blocks the normal weight regulation.
well, can you
So
explain? Oh,
yeah.
it's
So
just,
anyway, so that's how I got there. And then we found that the fructose was working in part by the uric acid mechanism, but there were other mechanisms too. And suddenly I went from being a kidney doctor to a uric acid doctor and then to a sugar doctor, especially fructose. And I spent a lot of research trying to figure out how fructose causes disease and its relative role in these epidemics that we are suffering from. And it's kind of an alarming discovery because it turns out that this is probably a primary mechanism that initiates a lot of these things that cause obesity and diabetes.
well, this is amazing, but could you now go back perhaps and explain, like you did so well in the book I just read, Why Nature Wants Us Fat, why this entire pathway existed and was beneficial to us in a time where we did not have the food security and abundance that we currently have in our culture?
Yeah. So when I was studying this, just as you say, here you have this food that when animals eat it, they get fat, they get insulin resistant, they raise the fats in their liver, they raise their fats in their blood. I was always taught that this was a disease. Metabolic syndrome is like a disease, but all these animals were doing it purposefully. And then we realized that they would do it purposefully in preparation for periods when there wasn't food around, like the hibernating animal, like the long distance migrating bird that has to migrate thousands of miles without stop. So it has to build up some fat and live off the fat. In these animals, fat is a survival mechanism. And some animals, they get fat because when they break down fat, not only do they produce calories or energy, but they also will make water. When you burn fat, you make water. So fat doesn't contain water, but when you burn fat, you produce water. So animals in the desert, like the camel, has an area of, some fat that it holds on to in its hump, which it can use to produce water when it absolutely needs it. Other animals put fat in their tails, in the desert. They don't want to put fat in their body because it will insulate them and overheat them. But whales will have fat all over their body, and they don't drink salt water, so they get their fresh water from burning their fat. So fat is a source of calories and water. And normally you don't need it, but if you're going to go into a setting where there's not food around, you want to have this. And then what we discovered was that this process is used in nature to help prepare an animal for when there's no food, that it holds over from, insects and, every animal you can think of seems to, can use this system. They can activate this system. And there's different ways that it gets activated, but even emotional stress will activate an animal to try to put on some fat. And so, we found out that it isn't just the fructose you eat, that when you're under stress, you start making fructose in your body. And you can make fructose only one way. You make it from carbs. And you make it from bread, rice, and potatoes and things like that, which raise the blood glucose. And when the blood glucose is normally a good fuel, but if the glucose levels go high, like after eating a hamburger with a big bun or eating, like foods that have a lot of sugar in it, your glucose goes up in the blood. And when that happens, it gets converted to fructose. Besides stimulating insulin, which isn't good either, it actually activates and produces fructose. So you can make fructose. And we found in our animal studies that the way animals get obese from carbs is largely from fructose. And you can activate it other ways as well. So fructose becomes this survival mechanism that animals use. And so, wow. And other nutrients don't do that. And then the question was, why? How does it work? Why does that do it? And it turns out that when you eat fructose, you make this uric acid. And the uric acid goes into where we make our energy. And so we make energy in our mitochondria. These are these little things that make all the energy that we use. And what happens is the mitochondria make the energy, which we call ATP, and then we use it. But if you want to store energy, you make fat, because fat is the stored energy, ATP is the active energy. So what happens is what fructose does, the trick it does is it suppresses the mitochondria and tells them to make less ATP. They want you to go into a low power mode. You're going to go into a low energy mode. And so the ATP levels come down, and then they only come down like 30%. So it's like a little warning sign. You still have ATP. You're not dying. You just are kind of getting a little warning sign. And then what happens is the body responds by saying, oh gosh, I'm beginning to run low on fuel. The gas tank light just lit up. I need to go to the pump and pump myself up. I'm going to eat more. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to store all this energy because I'm in trouble. And so it's a brilliant system, because this system is meant for when food is around. So it's, it's like the ants and the grasshopper, and the ants are storing food when there's still food around. And the grasshopper says, why are you guys doing this for? You're gonna, there's plenty of food here. But the ants know that there's going to be a period of time coming up called winter when there isn't food around. So they're storing food that way. But nature has also identified another way to store energy. And instead of taking little morsels of grains back to your nest, you put on fat. And the beauty of that is, you can, wherever you go, you can carry that storage of energy. So if you're storing, little grains in your nest, that's great. But what if something bad comes into the nest and you have to leave? Then you're in trouble, right? You're in trouble. But if you have the fat on you, then you can survive. Now, you don't want to be fat all the time, because a predator is going to eat you. So, the fattest animal is the last one running, it's the one that the lion can get. So you don't want to be too fat, right? But in nature, you want to be prepared. So if you know something bad is coming, you want to increase your fat stores. And then when that happens, you can survive the winter. And it's the fattest that survive, not the leanest, because you've got to have enough fat. So this is the principle of nature. Now, to get to your question.
I don't remember what it was.
Well, your question was to ask about evolution in humans. And I think.
Yes, and so I just would add to your conversation.
Yes.
Because I always like to tell people, even when you and I grew up, we did not have access to all of this cornucopia of fruits and juices 12 months
right.
after. And
you're 100% right.
So, in the past, it made sense. We would get the fruit, and then we would have winter where we would.
Yes, we're not hibernating anymore.
We're not hibernating.
We're just continuing to prepare for hibernation that never occurs. We're just eating all the time, and food's there, but it's because we've activated the switch. That's what's driving us. It isn't just that the food is there. We're also hungry because we're eating a lot of foods that contain sugar.
Yeah, explain.
And other things too that trigger the switch. And so, I
think it's very important, 2 points. Excuse me for interrupting, but I think this is a very important point, because many times we have been taught that we need carbohydrates for energy. And so I feel like this is differentiating between energy equaling calories versus what you are speaking about. It's actually making you a little bit more lethargic. And then I would like you to talk about the impact on appetite, because I think both those things are just so important.
Yeah, sure. So it turns out that in our studies, and this is going to sound controversial initially, but let me just explain what we found.
Love it.
And we did it in animals, and we've got evidence in humans. But think of glucose and fructose as two sugars that work differently. When you give fructose, you actually drop the active energy in the cell. When you give glucose, you increase the active energy in the cell. If you inject fructose into a human, the blood flow to the brain goes down because it's reducing the amount of energy that's being used by the brain. And actually what it does is it reduces the control, your self-control. It goes primarily to the areas of the brain involved in self-control. And that makes you, and it stimulates areas where hunger is. And so when you give fructose, you suddenly become hungry and you lose your control, you lose your self-control. And that's good if you're trying to gain weight, because it stimulates foraging, and you want to be able to find food. And to find food, you have to be willing to go into a dangerous area to find it. So having less control, I'm not worried about it. I'm just impulsive. I'm just going to go in there and find it. So fructose drops the energy and inhibits self-control. But if you infuse glucose into a human, blood flow goes up to the brain and you feel full. You actually feel full. Now, here, that sounds funny because everyone knows that carbs are not really good for you, but that's what happens in the first few minutes. But if you keep giving glucose so that the blood glucose level starts to go up, and believe me, when you eat potatoes with butter and salt and, fried potato, French fries, or if you drink a soft drink, you take in so much carbs that your blood glucose goes up. And so everybody sees a little bit of rise in their blood glucose after they eat, and it goes up and then it comes down. When it goes up, it stimulates insulin, and insulin moves the glucose into the cells and stimulates fat. So one way you can get fat is just from the effects of insulin. But the other problem is that when the glucose goes up, it's a signal to the animal to convert it to fructose. And so it converts it to fructose, and then that drops the energy and makes you hungry. And so there's a little bit of a delay. It's like 45 minutes after glucose where you start getting the hunger syndrome, whereas fructose induces the hunger almost immediately. And that's because of the delay in the conversion of glucose to fructose. So bottom line is that carbs turn out to be a major way to activate the switch. So carbs, sugar contains fructose, high fructose corn syrup, and that's added to 70% of our foods, processed foods, all that. But we also are eating a lot of starchy foods, and the starchy foods raise the blood glucose, triggering the switch to make fructose. So it's another source of fructose. And when we block the fructose, like we can do it in a mouse, we can block the fructose from being metabolized. We can protect animals from obesity and diabetes and a lot of conditions. So we think that this is a problem. And so low carb diets tend to work very well, because when you go on a low carb diet, you're avoiding sugar, but you're also avoiding starchy foods, starchy carbs that also make fructose. So it's a double whammy. You're knocking out the dietary fructose, but by knocking down dietary glucose, you keep glucose levels low, so there's not so much conversion to fructose. So that's why low carb diets, when you go on a low carb diet, suddenly you're not hungry. Low carb diets are famous for not making people, reducing hunger. And whereas if you go on a low fat diet to lose weight, they always tell you to do a caloric restriction because you're hungry. So you have to count calories. But when you go on a low carb diet, you don't have to count calories because you're not going to eat more. And that's why you can give a high fat diet on a low carb diet. So a lot of low carb diets are high fat. And, a lot of people say, hey, high fat is what causes obesity. A lot of people think that. And it's because fats have so many calories per gram, right? They're much more energy dense. But it isn't the fat that makes you fat. It's the carbs that stimulate your hunger. But once you're hungry, then high fat diets is kind of like putting wood on the fire because you can eat a lot of calories very quickly. So the way it sort of works is we eat these carbs that initiate hunger, and then you eat the fat, which helps drive rapid weight gain. And so that's sort of how it works.
So can you explain now about how this fits in with your theory of that was published, and I said the article was fantastic, about global obesity, but with the other theories, such as the carbohydrate insulin one, or
I can.
there's 5 of them total.
Yeah. So the big question is, what is causing us to gain weight? Everyone wants to know. And so there are these major ideas of what causes it. And there was a huge meeting in London where they brought in leaders from around the world to try to resolve that. I was actually at the meeting and I presented, but my talk was during the noon hour, and not that many people heard it. And what we did was we can actually show how all of these dietary hypotheses are correct in their own right, but only partially. It's sort of like the blind men feeling the elephant. They're all feeling something that is real. You feel the tail and you think it's this, and you feel the trunk and you think it's this. And what they've done is they have a very good idea of what's causing, of how their diet works, but they can't explain how they all connect. And the 2 major theories, one which has been led by researchers at Oxford and at the NIH, says that it's all about how many calories you eat. And they can say, hey, look, in the last 50 years, people are eating more. And you can prove it. We are eating more. The average American is eating more calories now than he did 30 years ago. So they can say, yeah, you know what? We're eating more, and that explains it. And it's got to be all the palatable foods. They call it palatable foods, which means tasty foods. That's what they mean. They mean the processed, the caramel corn, the things,
all the junk food. It's not.
Yeah, you go to the Chinese restaurants and it's like General Tso's chicken, fried with sugar. And it tastes so good, right? And so they're saying that's the reason. We're just eating too much. But what in biology has been shown is that animals regulate their weight normally extremely well. And humans also do that early in life, right? It's hard to get fat for a lot of people. And then around age 35, 40, suddenly you wake up and you go, hey, I'm gaining weight. I mean, this is a common thing. Not everybody regulates weight well. So there's some people getting obese as children, but you can see that there's, that this thing doesn't quite fit. And if it was just about choice, and there are a lot of people who, try to reduce their food intake, they lose weight, but then they gain it again. And so there's something more than that. So the carb people say, hey, actually it's carbs that cause obesity. And the primary mechanism that's been proposed is that carbs stimulate insulin. And when the insulin levels get really high, it's like continuously producing fat. And that's right too. You can show that people with obesity develop this thing called insulin resistance, where they have high insulin levels all the time. And insulin is like that hormone that wants to make you fat. So both groups seem to be right, but they seem to think that each one, that they're incompatible with each other. But as I mentioned, the way we think it works is that the carbs are critical for inducing the hunger and so forth. And actually, the carbs are what's responsible for the high insulin levels. And the carbs are responsible for a lot of the metabolic effects, like high blood pressure. And we've done studies where if you put an animal on a low calorie diet, so they're a low energy diet, and you keep them on a low calorie diet. So even though but you give them a lot of sugar, they want to eat more, but you don't give them more food. You actually give them so little that they actually lose weight, or they just barely hold on to the weight. When you do that, if it's a high sugar diet, even though they're on a caloric restriction, they don't gain weight because you're keeping the energy calories low. They're not eating many calories. Their weight doesn't go up. So the energy balance people say, yeah, see, it's weight, but they all become diabetic. They all become hypertensive. They all inside are filled with fat. They all get fatty liver. I mean, and their islets that make insulin get diseased. So it isn't just calories. You can calorically restrict, and you can have a terrible outcome if you're eating a lot of sugar. So what I learned was that, the energy balance people are right. Weight gain is driven by calories, eating too much. But what drives increased calories is the carbs. And the carbs are also working on the mitochondria through that uric acid pathway. And that is what's causing the metabolic problems. And we've also now linked this strongly with Alzheimer's.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. So I would love to talk about this a little more, because obviously all of these conditions that we have touched upon today so far have exploded over the last decades. And certainly one of the most concerning ones is Alzheimer's. So what was your initial thought process that got you to explore the connection between fructose and Alzheimer's?
Yeah. So as we were studying fructose, we realized that it had like three major things that it did. It was working on the mitochondria. So when you give fructose, you suppress mitochondria, and it's through that uric acid pathway. So the mitochondria are making less energy. The second thing we found was that fructose was really responsible for causing insulin resistance. And if we blocked fructose metabolism, we could block insulin resistance in the animal from almost anything. So the fructose seemed to be particularly important in causing insulin resistance. And then we found that fructose also stimulated inflammation, and it caused a rise in inflammatory markers in the blood, which I think was meant to be a survival mechanism, because having a low-grade inflammation helps protect the animal from infection, because you already got your immune system activated. And likewise, insulin resistance was meant to be a protection, because it reduced the need of the muscles to, block the energy uptake in the muscle, so that you had more energy, you could conserve energy easier. All right, so when I became worried about Alzheimer's, it's like the disease that we all are scared of, right? I mean, it's the disease, there's no treatment, it's increasing. It's the seventh most common cause of death. No one wants Alzheimer's because it's a terrible disease on the person as well as the family. It can go on for years. It is probably the disease none of us want, because you lose yourself. You lose who you are. And, you can lose a leg, but you're still you, but if you lose your brain, you're really in trouble. So it's the disease we're all scared of, and there's no treatment. So I became interested, right? And it's increasing in association with, and it's linked with obesity, and it's linked with diabetes, which is linked with our pathway. And it's linked with sugar intake, and it's linked with some other food intakes that are also activate this pathway. So I knew that there was an association. And so I started reading about Alzheimer's, and I saw that there were like 25 different drugs that have been developed to block the plaques that occur in Alzheimer's. And in Alzheimer's, you get these amyloid plaques in the brain. And all of them basically failed, or they have like just a tiny partial effect, or they have, so really doesn't seem to be the answer. So when you read the literature, they go, we've got to treat Alzheimer's earlier when it's just developing. And what are the characteristics that we can show? And guess what the three characteristics are that predict early Alzheimer's? The first one is you can show that the mitochondria in the brain aren't making as much ATP. And that is like a fructose effect. Then the brain starts to develop insulin resistance. Oh my God, that seems to be a specific fructose effect. And there's inflammation. They call it neuroinflammation because neuro is brain. They have inflammation. Those are the characteristics. That's the characteristics of fructose. So then you look in the literature and you find that if you give sugar to an animal, that they suddenly have trouble after about 3 weeks. They can't get through a maze as well as other animals. They can't think well. You put them in a water maze, they can't find the platform to climb up on. Or if they do it, takes a longer time. And then when you look in the brains of sugar-fed animals, you know what you find? Mitochondrial suppression of ATP production. That's exactly what happens in the liver. It's happening in the brain. What else you find? You find neuroinflammation. Oh my God. And then you find the insulin resistance in the brain. So it actually recreates it. And then I found two papers where they took the animals out for 18 weeks and they start developing amyloid plaques and this thing called tau protein, which is another characteristic.
Yep.
Basically, you can create Alzheimer's in animals by giving them a high sugar diet. Now, then we look at people with Alzheimer's, and guess what? They have very high fructose levels in their brain. Very high, 6 times higher than the age-matched control. They have activation of the entire pathway. All the enzymes I don't talk about it, but we measured all the different enzymes and the different steps. They're all turned on. And then it's been recently it's been identified where it's happening. It's happening in the inflammatory cells in the brain. They are metabolizing fructose. And a paper just came out where they blocked that enzyme and they rescued cognitive dysfunction in mice, laboratory mice. I mean, it's like there, the evidence there. And then recently, Mendelian randomization studies, which are supposed to be like this genetic, evidence, they're linking it. They found that uric acid was a strong risk factor. And if you look at people who are taking medicines to lower uric acid, 7 studies or 5 studies, I guess, all show a reduction in the risk for Alzheimer's. It's there. What we need to do. Also, if you raise a guy at Yale, took people and he raised their blood glucose, kind of like giving them starch, and then he could show 40 minutes later, because it takes 40 minutes. It was just exactly like predicted. 40 minutes later, he could measure the brain in the humans. He could measure fructose in the brain, and it goes up, boom, like big time. So you know what? Honestly, I think the cause of Alzheimer's is sugar and fructose. And it's not just the fructose we're eating, it's the fructose we're making. And we're making it in the brain when the blood glucose goes up. The number one cause is starchy foods and sugar. And if you want to do something, cut back on that. Cut back on the sugar, cut back on the starch, drink more water. If you have a high uric acid, talk to your docs about getting it lowered, especially if you have gout. And I think there's a lot of things we can do, okay? And we need to develop inhibitors of fructose, and we need to change our diets and try to eat more natural, healthy foods. We got to read the packages for processed foods and go, hey, you know what? That's high fructose corn syrup. That will cause Alzheimer's. You want Alzheimer's? Don't eat a lot of food with that.
Yeah, I mean, this is,
Now,
it's
tiny bit is okay.
right, like this is a far
Birthday.
cry. I mean, high fructose corn syrup, uh, you know, it's in everything now, but that's
Yeah,
a far cry from eating an apple or some berries. So
right.
if people turn around their
Yes.
packages, they're gonna start to see, I mean, it's in bread, it's in everything
Yeah.
to make it more enticing.
Yeah.
So I have
Yeah.
to,
Yeah. I just want to say one thing about fruit
yeah,
because it's so important to you, what you're talking
okay, I
about.
wanna hear
I
it.
just got to tell you this. We looked at some of the components of fruit. There's one called vitamin C. When we give vitamin C, we block that mitochondrial suppression. It blocks it partially, but it helps. It reduces the risk for obesity, metabolic syndrome, dementia. I mean, it works on the vitamin C is very important. Okay. Kiwi, fantastic fruit, high in vitamin C. Okay. We looked at another one called epicatechin. This is a component, it's a flavonol in fruit. It actually stimulates mitochondria to grow. It's like potentially really healthy. It's the component of dark chocolate that has been found to be beneficial. And when we gave epicatechin to humans, we could improve metabolic syndrome. Epicatechin is in fruit. Vitamin C, potassium. We did a study with potassium, and if you eat potassium-rich foods, it stimulates nitric oxide and all these things that are good for us, blocks oxidative stress, helps reduce metabolic syndrome. So the fruit have a lot of good things. You don't see that in soft drink, okay? You don't get that in a soft drink. And you don't have that much fructose in one fruit. So I think everyone should eat a fruit, at least one or two. You know, one with meals, with each meal would be perfect. You know, I don't want you to eat 10 fruit, and 2 fruits probably safe too, but don't eat a huge number of fruit or you're going to become like a bear. And if you become like a bear, you are going to start getting hungry when you eat too much sugar. Okay, so
Okay, well, I just love to know your response to people who still say Alzheimer's, it's genetics, knowing everything you know now.
well, first off, if Alzheimer's was a genetic disease, it wouldn't be increasing so much in our society, you know, because genetics, genes can only go as fast as you know, passing the genes to your kids and stuff. And that, you know, so genes can't explain this marked rise. I mean, Alzheimer's was extremely rare, even when they considered, you know, issues with diagnosis. It really increased. The second thing is there is one really important genetic risk for Alzheimer's, and that's called the ApoE4 genetic polymorphism. This is a gene that regulates a protein that carries fat, and it's called apolipoprotein E4. And if you're unlucky and you carry 2 of these, you know, we get one from our mother and one from our father, and if you have a double ApoE4, you do have an increased risk. And I think there's a link actually with metabolic syndrome. Now ApoE4 is being linked with high uric acids and by some studies. I think ApoE4 may activate the same process. But genetics are not the cause of Alzheimer's. I'm sorry to tell you that. It's diet. But the great news is that means that you can do something about it. Because if it was genetics, we would be all in trouble if it was the main thing. It isn't. And so we can stamp out this disease. I should tell you that, you know, a big insight came into me with, you know, why does sugar cause Alzheimer's? You know, because you like evolution and you like this idea of maladaption, you know, that we are maladapted today. And here's how it worked. When you ate sugar, fructose, you stimulated foraging. And foraging is this impulsiveness. You have to go in, we talked about, you have to go into dangerous areas, and in order to forage, you have to inhibit regions of the brain that are involved in self-control and memory and all these things. That's part of what when an animal forages, that's what they do. And so that's why fructose suppresses these areas. But if you do it transiently, it's fine. If you do it, one period of a year where you're going to be foraging for food because there's no winters coming, that's good. That's going to help you survive. But if you're doing it every day, not only are you foraging and eating more, getting fat, but you're also continuously suppressing the energy production in these areas. And, you've got to have energy to keep your neurons healthy, to keep your muscles healthy. So what happens is over time, you start developing a loss of tissue, and it causes a loss of the brain tissue. It causes sarcopenia, or muscle wasting. It causes all these things that are associated with aging. It's basically a stimulating, a turnover and death of cells. And so we think that it was meant to be a survival mechanism to help us find food. But when you're activated all the time, it's over time causing brain loss, and that's associated with development of dementia. And there's a syndrome where they're wandering around. I don't know, 7 out of 10 people with Alzheimer's have a thing called the wandering syndrome, where they can wander off. It's a terrible thing because, they can get lost, they can drive off. It's a dangerous thing. And, it's probably a foraging response that's carried over from this.
So I am wondering how this fits in with the concept of thrifty genes and the fructose hypothesis, and how they kind of all go together.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the big discoveries we had. The thrifty gene hypothesis was proposed in the 1950s, and it said the reason we're getting obese today is because there were periods of famine in our past where we had a mutation to help us survive the famine. But that made us thrifty with being able to hold on to calories easier. And so today we're eating all these calories, and we know how to store fat real well, better than but now in a time of plenty, this is causing obesity. And people had trouble finding that gene. But we knew that when I was studying uric acid, that humans have a higher uric acid than almost all other mammals. And it was related to a mutation that occurred in uric acid that makes our uric acid levels higher. And so I said, wow, when did that occur? And it turned out that it occurred like 15 million years ago, 12 to 15 million years ago.
Wow.
And during that was a time where there was a massive extinction of animals. 30% of the species died from global cooling, not global warming. And during that time, our ancestors, which were actually more like apes than humans at that time, but during that period, they were mainly living off fruit. And as global cooling occurred, the fruit became less available, especially during the colder months. And suddenly they started starving, and many of them went extinct. And I was really interested in this, so I found out that there was a world expert on it who was at the Museum of Natural History in London. So here I'm a kidney doc. I don't really know much about this, but I reached out to him. I told him, could this mutation have been a survival mutation? And he was interested. His name was Peter Andrews. Peter, if you're watching the show, thank you for everything you did, okay? And Peter says to me, why don't you come over and come and visit me at the museum? Wow! World-class anthropologist, kidney doc from, at that time I was from Florida, University of Florida. So I took my family over, And I went to the museum, and they wandered around the museum, and I actually met with Peter. We go to this back room and we talk about this, and we realize that this mutation might have allowed animals to store fat from fruit better, and that they might have helped them survive. So we wrote this hypothesis, but then how do we prove it? And then we meet this guy named Steve Benner, who's this brilliant guy who's been nominated for the Nobel Prize. He was the first one to resurrect an extinct gene. He started this whole Jurassic Park thing. He was the first one. And he said to me, we can, I know a friend of mine, Eric, he can resurrect that extinct gene for you. So, really? So I met with Eric. He resurrected this extinct gene. And then we did studies and we could show that when our ancestors had that gene, we could still make fat from fructose, but it was a small amount. But once that gene got mutated, we could make a lot more fat from the same amount of sugar. And that meant that back then, these animals were starving, but they could make more fat from the same amount of fructose so they could survive the winter. And so there is a thrifty gene. There is. And then we approved it another way too. So I think that, that diet, just as you say, there was these genes that made us predisposed, and then food became available 24/7. You can go down to you can find a grocery store at 2 a.m, and you can fill your cart, and some of them have like 10,000 types of food in one store, and you can eat what you want. And what we found was that things that are sweet, like the reason we have a sweet taste is to help us find these foods that contain fructose and glucose, and that could help us put on fat. And actually salt turns out to help to convert glucose to fructose. So salt actually is important as well. So and high salt diets, when we put animals on high salt diets, I know a lot of low salt diets not necessarily good. High salt diets though are not good, and after it takes months, but then the animals become obese from that, and because they're converting the carbs to fructose, and that's why French fries, God, they're the worst of all foods, and they don't contain fructose. But this potato, it's really hot and warm, and it gets converted to glucose quickly, and it's got the salt, which is like it helps catalyze the reaction to make it to fructose. And then it's covered in fat and oil, which is like the calories that the carbs use, triggering the switch that helps you gain weight. In fact, they've just shown that if you activate this switch and you become like leptin resistant, suddenly the liking of fatty foods go way up. So a normal animal that is healthy doesn't really crave fat. But if you activate this switch, suddenly you start craving fat. There's no taste buds for fat. This is all through here. So it's like totally cool. This switch was meant to make us fat. It makes you hungry. It makes you lose your control of appetite. And it stimulates, makes you look for foods that are high calorie, like fat, 9 calories per gram. And so you can see how the energy balance people are partially right. For sure, the carb people are closer to being right. And then you have the seed oil people, and it's right. Fat is important. And it's because it's part of this whole pathway. And so suddenly we see all the pathways, the protein sparing hypotheses and all these different things, and they fit. And then you go, something's got to be right here, because we can suddenly explain all these different contrasting papers, and why does this say this and this one say this? And then you go, well, that goes right here. This is a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. And this one, yeah, it looks like it doesn't fit, but actually it's right there. Sorry, I'm getting carried away.
No, well, the bottom line, how I would see it from my view is that we are just a mismatch for our modern environment. But I want
Oh,
to,
absolutely.
there's something you mentioned, and I really want to talk about this a little more because this is a huge topic, and that is salt, salt, salt. And coming from a kidney doctor, this is very important because I've heard you talk about it, and that it, so when you're eating too much salt, your body perceives it as dehydration and emergency, and that will
Yeah.
trigger the switch. However, but what I have heard you say also is if you are adequately hydrated, that it could be okay.
Yeah. So, so you're 100%. So first off, there are a lot, there's people who say that salt doesn't is actually healthy, and salt is healthy, and water is healthy. And it's the balance that counts. It's the balance. Now, if you eat too much salt or you don't drink enough water, you can become dehydrated. And you can see that in your blood tests. There's a test called serum sodium. And if your serum sodium, even if it's upper ends of normal, we now know that that means you're slightly dehydrated. And there are other ways to look at the urine. If your urine is yellow, it usually means you're dehydrated. So salt and water are critical for life. And you don't want to be on a super low salt diet. You don't want to be on a high salt diet. You want to be just right. But it's really the balance of salt and water. So if you're taking a high salt diet and you're drinking a ton of water, you might be okay. So here's how we proved that. I worked with a guy named Namath Tanvi, who maybe you should interview sometime. He's in Asia
Sure.
Minor. He's in Turkey. He's a brilliant clinical scientist, and he does great studies. And he did this study with me, but he got the idea kind of on his own from looking at what we were doing in animals. And he said, okay, I'm going to prove that salt is healthy if you drink a lot of water, and it's not healthy if you don't. So one of the great things is, soups you can mix salt into, and you can make a really salty soup. And you can't really tell if it's like a creamy soup or something. You can't really tell how much salt is in there. So he made this soup that was really, had like 2 or 3 grams of salt. I mean, it was like
A lot.
salty soup, a lot. Okay. And then he gave it to people with or without water. So there were 3 groups. There was one group that got soup and no water. The second group got soup and some water. And then another group got soup and a lot of water. Like a liter and a half or something. I forget how much it was. And then they measured the serum sodium to look at how much dehydration was induced. Because if the salt's really high, the serum sodium, which sodium's in salt, will go up. And we knew that could trigger the production of fructose, and that would theoretically activate this biologic switch. And we developed markers in the blood to look for that, or have identified. And so we know, and like blood pressure is also related to this pathway. So what we did was, if we gave salty soup, the blood pressure shot up. There are markers of like inflammation and some of these things that we know are fructose effects. We had activated the switch. Blood pressure high.
How quickly would this happen then?
Within an hour.
So you
Within
mean
an hour.
at one time?
Within an hour. Actually, the blood pressure goes up within 15 minutes.
So
okay,
after hot dogs, sauerkraut, and pickle, and some mustard, I mean, I'm just once in a while.
Yeah.
I mean,
Every now there's nothing wrong with having a piece of cake every now and then, or having
sure.
salty food. Unless you have an active problem with severe high blood pressure or something, you don't want to eat a lot of salt. But there's nothing wrong with occasionally eating foods that are not good for us, so long as it's really occasional. And if you're trying to be as healthy as possible, you probably should avoid it. But
Once in a
life is
while.
life is long, and an occasional thing. I mean, if I'm at a birthday party and they hand me a little piece of cake and it's my son, or I eat it. But I know it's not good for me, but it's like part of the culture and so forth. Anyway,
Well,
getting back. Yeah.
it's,
I mean, you don't have to do it. Uh, and,
it's
and,
good to
and
know. I want to talk about another thing that you're a part of or discovery recently that is fun on a positive note. And that is allulose, and explaining why this is so different and how it feeds in with your entire
yeah.
hypothesis and all the research on it.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to finish with that can-based experiment, because when he gave water with the salt, there was no
Sure,
activation.
please do.
So just that, the humans that drank a lot of water could keep their serum sodium normal, blood pressure didn't go up, and we didn't activate the switch. So we could show that water is protected, and everyone should drink 6 to 8 glasses of water a day. Now you're bringing up a new thing, and disclosure. I'm half-time university at this point, but I joined this company called RX Sugar that markets allulose. And the reason I joined them is because I believe that allulose looks like a really interesting and potentially beneficial sugar. It looks just like fructose, but it has a part of the molecules just shifted a little bit, and it turns out that doesn't activate the switch. So when you give this sugar, it does not activate this, does not cause the ATP levels to fall, et cetera. And instead, it stimulates GLP-1. And I think everyone has heard about how GLP-1 agonists are causing weight loss, and people are taking semaglutide, and it's the new thing. But it's very interesting. This little sugar kind of counters fructose and stimulates GLP-1. And it helps control blood glucose, and it's preventing that rise after a meal largely. It's fairly amazing. So I'm interested in this sugar. I think that a lot of people are getting excited about it because so many low-calorie sugars are neutral. Meaning that they don't have calories. They don't seem to cause weight gain, but it's not like they're beneficial. And some of them, carry worries, concerns based on what they are and how safe they are. But here's this new natural sugar, and it seems to have beneficial effects. So I am actively studying it. I want to understand how it works. I want to know more about it, but it looks pretty promising, and it's available. It's generally regarded as safe. It's available in chocolates and so forth. I think that I think it's a good thing. I'm now eating some allulose chocolate bars every day, but we need to do more studies. I'm not going to I don't want to promote the company in a way that's there's no falsehood here. So this is really, it looks like a very healthy sugar, but we certainly want to do more studies.
Well, I think it's fun, again, because people do enjoy the sweet taste, and as long as it doesn't trigger cravings for later. So I traditionally have not recommended sweeteners, just as a rule, only because it can generate that. But this seems to be different so far.
I think the reason it stimulates satiety, or it kind of makes you feel full, is because it stimulates GLP-1. Sweetness in general can make people continue to like sweet things. So that's true. But this one is sort of different. It doesn't seem to stimulate continued craving, probably because of its GLP-1 satiety stimulation. So it makes you feel full. For example, if you want to reduce how much you may eat at a meal, if you ate one of these bars in the mid-afternoon, it might actually reduce or make you feel full sooner at night. So you may not eat as much of the dinner as you normally would. Sort of like semaglutide and Ozempic. It's sort of this. It's really sort of the same type of thing, but it's a natural stimulant, and it only works for a few hours after you give it. So it's goes up and then it comes down, the GLP-1.
I think it's worth trying, and
Yep.
that's great. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for coming on today, but also, honestly, thank you for all of your contributions to the field with obesity and Alzheimer's, and just having another picture about what people can do and how this has all happened.
Thank you, Bonnie. It really is great being on your show. I really appreciate it, and spread the word. And then, I have a website, drrichardjohnson.com. I have an Instagram, which is Dr. Richard J. Johnson.
Oh, I will absolutely put all of the links to get your content, and I would also encourage everyone to read your latest book, which I thought was very well done. Why Nature Wants Us Fat, and like I mentioned, the journal articles, of which I did do a video on, which I'll send you.
Thank you so much, buddy. Bye, everyone.